A long-standing belief has circulated for centuries, not only among travellers and storytellers, but also among certain scholars, claiming that the Druids held a doctrine similar to that of Pythagoras. According to this idea, the soul did not end with death, but instead moved into another body, human or animal, as a form of repayment for failures committed during life. This assumption rests largely on a famous passage from Julius Caesar's account of the Gallic War, where he states that the Druids taught that souls do not perish, but pass from one body to another after death. Caesar adds that this belief encouraged bravery, because fear of death lost its power. He does not specify what kind of body the soul entered next, yet the context strongly suggests a human form rather than an animal one. Other ancient writers expanded on this idea. Diodorus, writing about the Gauls, claimed that a doctrine resembling that of Pythagoras was widespread among them, teaching that souls were immortal and returned to life after a fixed number of years in another body. Strabo reported that the Druids, along with others, believed both the soul and the universe were indestructible, even though fire and water would one day overwhelm them. Pomponius Mela described the Druids as teaching that souls were eternal and that life continued in another realm after death. According to him, this belief made people more willing to face war, since death was not seen as an end. He even noted that personal belongings were buried or burned with the dead, debts were postponed until the next world, and in rare cases individuals willingly joined their relatives on funeral pyres to share the new existence. Yet Pomponius misunderstood the origins of these customs. Burial goods and beliefs in life beyond death existed long before Roman contact with Gaul. They were not inventions designed to manipulate courage in battle. Over time, however, Roman authors increasingly linked Celtic beliefs with Pythagorean philosophy. This connection gained popularity through writers such as Timagenes and later Ammianus Marcellinus, who described the Druids as members of an inner circle of Pythagorean thought. Stories began to circulate claiming that a follower or slave of Pythagoras had travelled among the Celts and taught them his doctrines. Other writers suggested that the Celts had known Pythagorean philosophy even before Greece itself. These stories grew more elaborate with time. Some claim that Greek philosophers learned from the Celts rather than the other way around. Others mocked the idea, noting that what the so-called barbarians believed about the soul was supposedly identical to the teachings of Pythagoras. Yet behind these claims stood little solid evidence. The figure often invoked to explain this transmission, a mythical being associated with resurrection and immortality, belonged firmly to legend rather than history. What is clear is that the idea of souls returning to new bodies existed long before Pythagoras, particularly in India and other ancient cultures. There is no proof that Pythagoras ever encountered the Celtic world. Some scholars argued that Greek ideas may have reached Celtic lands through Mediterranean trade centres, but even they admitted that such ideas would have had little influence. Celtic beliefs about the afterlife centred on continuity rather than punishment. The dead were thought to move into another realm where life continued much as before, free from hardship. The real issue lies in how ancient writers interpreted similarities. They often focused on surface resemblances rather than deeper meaning. Because both Greeks and Celts spoke of survival after death, Roman authors assumed a shared origin. Yet the details tell a different story. Celtic customs surrounding burial and remembrance emphasize personal identity, continuing beyond death. Pythagorean thought, by contrast, described the soul as changing bodies repeatedly, as a form of moral consequence. The idea of rebirth as punishment simply does not exist in Celtic tradition. Celtic stories describe rebirth in a very different way. In Irish tradition, it was believed that an ancestor might reappear within a descendant. The same soul could return, not as punishment, but as continuation. Ancient poetry even speaks of a spirit taking on another body elsewhere. Heroes, divine beings, and legendary figures were believed capable of returning to the world more than once, descending again into human form. These beliefs were never systematized into a universal doctrine. They applied mainly to exceptional individuals, gods, heroes, and kings. There was no moral requirement attached, no cycle of sin and redemption. Supernatural beings were thought capable of taking human form, entering the world through birth, sometimes after passing through animal or symbolic shapes. This idea appears across Celtic lands, including Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, where naming children after ancestors carried deep spiritual meaning. Such beliefs are not unique to Celtic culture. Across the world, many societies viewed children as the return of their ancestors. Stories of transformation and rebirth appear globally. In Celtic legend, these ideas are woven into myth rather than doctrine. One tale recounts the life of an ancient man who lived through multiple invasions of Ireland, transforming successively into animals and finally returning as a human through rebirth. Another tells of a hero born after a god enters the mortal world in an unusual form, revealing himself only later. Other legends describe gods and heroes returning after centuries, or rival beings repeatedly changing shape through birds, beasts, warriors, and monsters before becoming animals central to epic tales. In one story, a woman is transformed into a tiny creature, swallowed and reborn as a child, later reclaimed by her divine husband. Welsh tradition tells of a poet who claims to have existed in countless forms across time, witnessing the events of both myth and history, shifting between human, animal, object, and abstract existence. When these stories are examined closely, patterns emerge. Some describe simple transformation from one form to another. Others reflect a belief in divine projection, where a god returns through birth as a new version of himself. These ideas are tied closely to kingship, divinity, and solar symbolism. They are not moral systems nor philosophical frameworks, but narrative tools rooted in myth. The overall conclusion reached by Darbois still holds up, even if the way the examples are arranged feels slightly reversed. The entire material reads far more like a classic passage-through forms narrative, while the Finn tradition fits better with the idea of a return as oneself in a later human life. What matters most is the wider pattern. Stories of full soul migration across multiple shapes appear as rare exceptions, and those exceptions only make the broader Celtic tendency clearer. In much of the older tradition, the privilege of returning did not sit evenly across society. It clustered around figures of sacred blood, royal ancestry, or beings who hovered between human and divine. A useful comparison can be drawn with ancient Egypt, where the strongest form of repeated return was originally tied to the pharaoh. The implication is not that one culture copied the other, but that both systems connect rebirth to the logic of divine kingship. That kind of rebirth is fundamentally different from the Pythagorean moral mechanism, where a soul is pushed into new bodies as a penalty or cleansing for wrongdoing. Later developments, however, complicate the picture. In Egypt, a belief emerged that rebirth might extend beyond the king and become available to many, perhaps even most people. That shift looks like an expansion of the royal model. Once a society accepts that the ruler's essence can return, it becomes tempting for the powerful to claim the same pathway, and for the idea to drift outward into wider layers of belief. Something similar can be traced in Ireland in the later imaginative landscape. The Tuatha De Danann, once presented as a divine ruling race, gradually lose that high status in later tradition and become the Seeder, the mound dwellers, the fairy folk. In that altered world, return is no longer restricted to king gods alone. The Shidie begin to look like a community of spirits waiting to re-enter human life, repeating the process again and again. A pattern that once belonged to sacred rulers becomes attached to the dead more generally, not as a moral punishment, but as a continuing rhythm of existence. Even in this broader form, the belief does not slide into a Greek-style system of ethical repayment. Rebirth does not become a courtroom sentence. It remains closer to a native idea of survival and return, an older instinct that may have resurfaced after long periods of change. This older line is the one hinted at by ancient observers who speak of Druids and Gauls teaching that the soul does not end and that it appears again elsewhere. Some classical remarks that explicitly claim a direct Pythagorean identity are best understood as confusion. They mix a Celtic belief in continued life with a Greek philosophical doctrine that carries a very different meaning and purpose. When the idea is stripped to its simplest shape, the proposed origin looks less like imported philosophy and more like a widespread human pattern found in many traditional societies. The spirit of an ancestor is imagined as waiting near familiar places, alert for a chance to return. A woman passing through that space becomes the doorway, and a new child becomes the vessel. Modern ethnographic parallels describe systems like this among indigenous peoples in Australia and elsewhere, where local spirits are tied to landscape, to specific sites, and to the cycle of human birth. These landscape spirits resemble the Celtic mound spirits, closely enough to suggest that both emerged from comparable ways of thinking. Not scholarly argument, but everyday belief shaped by land, ancestry, and the felt presence of the dead. From this angle, the well-known Irish and Brythonic stories look like late, blurred retellings of a much older doctrine, reshaped by myth, poetry, and shifting religious imagination. At the same time, another stream runs alongside it, the special rebirth of kings. That strand is not necessarily later, and it may have existed side by side with older, popular beliefs, influencing them and being influenced in return. In royal ideology, the king is framed as the child of a solar power, and that relationship generates its own logic of return. The sun that sets is followed by the sun that rises. The new sun appears as a projection of the old sun. In the same symbolic grammar, the new king can be understood as a projected continuation of the old king. Rebirth becomes less about souls wandering and more about sacred succession made cosmic. It is even possible that the two notions fed into each other. The ancestor return model belongs to the wider population rooted in family and place. The solar projection model belongs to royalty, rooted in divine legitimacy. Over time, these ideas could blur at the edges, especially when stories attempt to explain why certain heroes and monarchs seem to come back in later generations. Yet traces suggest that royal return retained a distinctive character of its own, resurfacing repeatedly as a special explanation attached to famous names. With that foundation in mind, the focus shifts from rebirth to ritual life, because the next question is not only what Druids believed, but what they did. If Druids can be shown to have played a direct role in the major seasonal festivals, their status as a real priestly class becomes harder to dismiss. Their place would not be a modern fantasy projected backward, but something embedded in religious practice itself. The Celtic year, in its earliest form, appears to have been governed first by the sun's cycle, rather than by a tidy seasonal calendar. Instead of being mapped neatly onto solstices and equinoxes, it seems to have been guided by the lived reality of warmth, light, and the turning of the year as people experienced it. The system of counting time, as far as it can be reconstructed, leans strongly toward the moon. Months and intervals were measured through lunar movement, and only later did attempts emerge to align lunar counting with solar rhythm. 3 festivals stand out with particular clarity: Samhain at the start of November, Beltane at the start of May, and Lughnasadh at the start of August. Midsummer was also marked, sharing familiar European features, though later tradition sometimes blended its rituals with those of Beltane. The year's opening point was Samhain, a threshold moment when the dark half of the year began to dominate. Yet the promise of returning growth was not forgotten. It likely began as a harvest-related observance, tied not only to gathering, but to the final processing of crops. With Christianization, elements of Samhain were drawn into winter celebrations, and some rites drifted into the season that later centered on Christmas. At Samhain, a central image returns again and again: the Great Fire. The old household flames were extinguished as the old year ended, and hearths were rekindled from a new sacred source. Samhain was also remembered as a night of the dead, a season when unseen presences were believed to move across the countryside. People carried burning brands around fields and settlements, not for spectacle, but to push back what was feared to be wandering influence. Practical winter work blended into ritual. Animals were slaughtered for the cold months ahead and preserved, and in that action older sacrificial patterns may still be faintly visible. In later Christian times, a November slaughter became linked to Saint Martin, yet the rhythm suggests an older structure beneath the saint's name, tied to early November gatherings and fairs where trade and exchange were as important as ceremonies. Samhain also carried a strong element of divination. It was treated as a hinge point when the future could be glimpsed. In Ireland, tradition places a major national assembly at Tara at this time, with an atmosphere of law, politics, and solemn ritual merged into one. Another memory anchors sacrifice and fire at Tlachtga in Meath, describing a gathering of Druids on Samhain Eve, and the burning of offerings in the Great Flame. Later accounts add details of animal sacrifice and gifts to the spirits of the year's dead. Whether every detail can be trusted is less important than the persistence of the same outline: a great fire, a sacred gathering, and priestly figures attached to the rite. Beltane, by contrast, turns toward fertility and protection. It is remembered above all for its May fires. Tradition describes 2 fires kindled in each region, and cattle driven between them to guard against sickness. Accounts of early Christian-era Ireland preserve the idea that lighting the fire was not an ordinary act, but something controlled by a chief ritual specialist. The festival also carried a fair because among Celtic communities, large gatherings were rarely only religious. They were social marketplaces as well, moments of exchange where the year's economy and the year's ritual met in the same space. The May fire is repeatedly linked to trees. In some places, the fire was lit under a sacred tree, or a pole dressed in greenery stood at its centre, or even an entire tree was burned. These details hint at older layers of tree veneration, not as poetry but as ritual practice. Place names and local memory preserve traces of where such ceremonies were said to occur, suggesting that the festival was anchored to specific landscapes and remembered sites, rather than being a vague, seasonal idea. In Scotland, later folk custom preserves a striking shadow of older sacrifice logic. A ceremonial cake was divided, one portion blackened, and whoever received it was marked out as a special figure for the day. That person was made to leap through the fire and was spoken of as dead during the celebration. In modern eyes, it looks like play, but the shape of the ritual feels like a softened survival of something more severe. the memory of a devoted victim, transformed into symbolic action. May customs also carry figures that look like remnants of older spirit beliefs. The May king and queen, and later characters such as Robin Hood and Maid Marian. In many European traditions, these roles function as living embodiments of the season's growth, staged to help fertility through drama and union. Similar patterns appear elsewhere in Indo-European ritual worlds. And Irish kingship tradition also preserves the idea of a symbolic marriage between the ruler and a female figure representing the land. Care is needed here because it is easy to overreach and label every spring custom as Druidic. The safer approach is to focus only on those elements that show a direct line: the sacred fires, the ritual authority over lighting them, and the remembered association with priestly action. After Samhain and Bealtaine, the question becomes whether Lughnasadh can be linked in the same way. This August festival was celebrated in Ireland at Tailten in honour of Lugh, a major deity associated with light and skill. On the continent, Gaulish gatherings at places tied to a related figure suggest a similar pattern of devotion. Lugh is repeatedly framed as a force of brightness and knowledge, and the festival was explained as his celebration. Another story ties it to the death of Tailtiu, remembered as his foster mother, whose passing was recalled each year. Beneath the mythic explanation lies a deeper theme: the festival's closeness to the dead and to the waning of summer's strength, when rituals were used to secure the return of vitality for the coming cycle. At Tailten, games were held, contests of strength, racing, and public competition. It is tempting to interpret these in terms of selecting a temporary sacred representative, but another interpretation fits the older logic of ritual energy. Physical exertion, displayed publicly, was thought to renew the divine power of the place, strengthening the god whose force was believed to fade with the year's passage. In this view, the games do not crown a man as a god for a year so much as they feed the god through the release of communal power. Lughnasadh was also tied to prosperity in a very direct way. Tradition held that neglecting its rites threatened crops, fruit, milk, and even fishing yields. A fair followed, and mass marriages were remembered as part of the season, including unions described as casual or temporary. This reveals the festival as more than a single ceremony. It was a full social mechanism binding fertility, trade, alliance, and divine favour into one public event. Tailtiu herself appears as an older, earth or harvest figure, a nourishing presence like a soil goddess. The pairing of Tailtiu with Lugh suggests an older agricultural structure into which a solar deity was fitted. The myth may function as an explanation for this fusion. In the ritual imagination, Lugh's festival can be read as his marriage, not in private romance, but as a symbolic union with the land itself. An old story even frames this as a vision shown to a king and his druid, where Lugh appears with a crowned female figure identified as the sovereignty of Ireland, enduring until the end of time. The language is mythical, but the political meaning is clear. Kingship, fertility, and divine order are being tied together. That connection matters because Irish kingship ritual repeatedly shows priestly involvement. If a druid stands beside a king in a vision meant to explain sovereignty and sacred union, it becomes easier to argue that the priesthood was not separate from the festival cycle. Gatherings such as Tailten also resemble the large assemblies described elsewhere in Celtic lands, where religious authority and legal or political arbitration were intertwined. If kingship ceremonies carried priestly implications, then a festival bound tightly to kingship would likely have been supervised in the same way. Later, observers and antiquarians noted how bonfire festivals survived for a long time across Britain and parts of France, and some records claim that fires were traditionally lit on sites remembered as sacred, sometimes even associated directly with Druids. In Scotland, descriptions appear of Beltane fires on artificial mounds, ringed by low walls and marked by standing stones, places understood locally as old ritual grounds. In Dartmoor, a May rite is recorded where young men gathered at a standing stone, captured a lamb, and sacrificed and roasted it as part of the day's celebration, followed by dancing and contests. Whether every detail reflects ancient practice is uncertain, but the similarity to older sacrificial outlines is hard to miss. Survivals also appear in the idea of extinguishing all local fires and relighting them from a single forced fire made by friction, then carrying that renewed flame back to homes. This matches the logic of Samhain renewal. In some places, the fire was produced with oak, using wheels and spindles, pointing toward a tree cult layer and towards solar symbolism, since the oak was often imagined as a storehouse of fire and a partner of the sun. Midsummer ceremonies involving wheels deepen that association, linking fire, turning motion, and the sun's cycle into a single ritual language. The link between Druids and the great turning points of the Celtic year can be traced with unusual clarity. Across different regions and across many centuries of changing religion, the same seasonal framework keeps resurfacing, and the same kind of ritual role keeps appearing beside it. Later writers, observing surviving customs, argued that the Irish Druids functioned as attendants of an old festival calendar that had deep roots in Central European tradition. Once that pattern is accepted for Ireland, it becomes difficult to imagine that the Druids of Gaul served a completely different purpose. The structure of the year, the use of sacred fire, and the repeated claim that specialist religious figures controlled key rites all point in the same direction. In Brittany, for example, the summer fire festival did not vanish when Christianity arrived. It was reshaped. The old mid-year rites were rebranded as St. John's Day, but the centerpiece remained the same. Great bonfires, dancing through the night, and music carrying across the fields. Peasants circled the flames in their holiday clothing while the local bagpipes set the rhythm. In some parishes, the priest himself led a procession to ignite the fire, an act that looks less like a simple blessing and more like a takeover of an older sacred duty. A charred brand carried home was believed to protect a house from lightning, much like the preserved piece of a winter log was said to guard a household through the cold season. The names changed, the public explanations changed, yet the protective logic of the sacred ember remained. Other Breton customs gathered around ancient stones. In June, unmarried young people assembled beside a dolmen. The boys brought green ears of grain, the girls carried flax flowers. These were laid on the stone, and if they stayed fresh, the affection of a courting pair was expected to last. A dance followed, circling the monument, and local tradition insisted that this was something inherited from the Druids. Similar spring and early summer rites across France mirror those seen in Britain so closely that it is often hard to separate one from the other. The resemblance suggests not imitation in later times, but an older shared rhythm that endured underneath regional differences. Evidence of tension between church leaders and these seasonal celebrations appears early. A bishop in the 7th century urged people not to observe May customs and warned against the pagan-style feast that had been attached to St. John's Day. The warnings matter because they reveal what still had power. May rites, midsummer fires, and the older emotional pull of the calendar. Even in Brittany today, St. John's Eve and Halloween can still be treated as nights close to the dead, with meals and gatherings reflecting an older sense that certain dates open a door between worlds. From seasonal festivals, the narrative turns to something darker: sacrifice. Some modern writers have tried to deny that Druids practiced human sacrifice at all, rejecting the idea as hostile propaganda. Yet the ancient references are too numerous and too blunt to dismiss easily. Roman authors describe sacred spaces stained with the blood of captives. Another source presents human offering as a normal element of religious life, claiming that major sacrifices required a druid's presence and authority. Accounts say that people suffering painful illness, or men facing mortal danger in war, could vow a life to the gods in exchange for survival, and that druids would then carry out the offering. The logic behind the act is described in stark terms. One life was given to redeem another. Whether the Romans fully understood what they saw is open to question, but the repeated insistence that sacrifice belonged to the religious system cannot be waved away as a single misunderstanding. The most famous image associated with these reports is the story of huge wicker figures filled with living victims and then set alight. Some sources say that criminals were preferred as offerings, yet they add that when criminals were scarce, innocents could be taken instead. Another writer insists that the larger the number of victims, the better the land's yield. That connection between death and fertility appears in many ancient cultures, and in this telling it is tied to seasonal growth, not to punishment for wrongdoing. The spring festival at the start of May becomes the likeliest setting for such rites in this framework, because May fires are explicitly linked to fertility and protection. The brutal logic would be that the sun's power needed renewal at the opening of the growing season, and the strongest gift possible was life itself. Comparable beliefs are known elsewhere, including in places where people claimed that blood fed the gods who controlled rain and crops. Traces of similar thinking have survived in disturbing forms. In early modern England, during a public burning, bystanders were reportedly heard saying that it would have been better if it had happened earlier in the season, because it might have helped the crops. The comment is horrifying, yet it reveals how deeply the old fertility logic could linger in popular imagination even after the official theology had changed. In Irish tradition, another strand places victims in a holy fire on the eve of the winter festival, which, if accurate, would mean that sacrifice could be attached not only to spring renewal, but also to the dangerous threshold of the dark season. Later, European customs, although different in target, preserve a shape that resembles the older stories. In parts of France, officials once burned baskets filled with animals at midsummer. Similar practices appear among neighbouring peoples, where burning creatures in woven containers is recorded as a seasonal act. In a major city, this kind of rite is reported to have continued into the early modern era before disappearing. The most plausible reading is that these were softened survivals, replacing human victims with animals, yet retaining the dramatic structure of the wicker container and the public fire. Even so, the famous wicker burning account raises practical questions. Wicker containers are highly flammable, yet if they burned too fast, a structure might collapse before it could do what the story claims. If green withes were used, they would resist burning, but then the fire would need heavy fuel around it. Victims would almost certainly have to be bound, otherwise the struggle for escape would tear apart weak materials. Whether the figures stood upright or were laid flat also affects how the fire would work. The sheer amount of fuel required to burn bodies is enormous, and later, historical burnings often required wagon loads of wood. The old descriptions may compress complex ritual setups into a dramatic sentence. The uncertainty does not make the practice less grim. It simply shows how difficult it is to reconstruct the exact method behind the reports. In Northern legend, another grim detail appears. A story that an aged chief religious figure was burned alive on a cairn, while his successor circled the place to watch the departing spirit. The value of such a tale lies not in courtroom proof, but in the fact that it reflects how people imagined sacred transition and succession. Other ancient descriptions of Druidic sacrifice focus not on mass burning, but on divination. One account says that when important decisions had to be made, a man was killed with a knife, and the future was read in the convulsions of his limbs and in the flow of blood. Another version places the fatal blow differently, describing a sword stroke. The point in both is the same. Death becomes a medium of knowledge, and the body becomes a message. The details resemble known sacrificial divination practices in other parts of the ancient world, where blood and movement were treated as signs that revealed what the gods intended. One source also mentions victims being killed by arrows. It is a rare detail in the classical record, but it fits a broader symbolic pattern that appears across cultures. Arrow rites have been interpreted as a form of sympathetic magic, where the spilling of blood onto the ground is meant to awaken the earth's fertility or call down rain. In some myths, the act is explained as coupling the earth with the victim, turning sacrifice into a grim imitation of union between land and life force. Another interpretation treats blood as transformed rain, a gift that feeds soil and crop. Either way, the logic is agricultural and seasonal rather than moral. The image has curious echoes in later European legends and festivals, where archery contests become central and where a forest hero is described as bleeding to death. Similar motifs appear in stories from other regions, and even in later narratives, where an arrow martyr becomes a central figure. In northern Eurasia, sacred trees were sometimes greeted with arrows, an act that can be read not only as respect, but as a symbolic request for renewal, as if the arrow itself carried the idea of rain and refreshment. Another horror appears briefly in the ancient record: impalement within sacred precincts. This is not described at length by most writers, yet a later historian describing a British uprising includes a scene of ritualized cruelty carried out in a grove sacred to a victory goddess. The victims were noble women, and the violence is described as being accompanied by feasting and ceremony. The account is so extreme that it raises the question of exaggeration, but the mention of a particular grove and a named deity places it in a ritual setting rather than in random brutality. What is striking in those narratives is the absence of Druids as explicit actors in the rebellion's core events. A single earlier episode references Druids being attacked elsewhere, but in the rising itself the Queen seems to act as ritual leader in her own right. That does not prove the Druids were absent everywhere, but it does caution against turning every sacred act into Druidic supervision by default. The goddess invoked in the story is obscure, but there are continental parallels to a similarly named victory goddess worshipped among Gauls. Later inscriptions reveal related names used in military dedications and protective cults under the Roman Empire, sometimes blended with foreign mother goddess traditions. It is possible that coincidence and overlapping meanings have blurred identities that were originally separate. At the same time, if a victory goddess on the continent belonged to a region where Druidic authority was strong, it becomes at least conceivable that similar worship existed in Britain as well. Traditional Irish material preserves a striking claim about how fertility could be restored when the land seemed to fail. In that telling, ritual specialists advise that the blood of a slain victim should be mixed into barren soil and smeared onto trees that had withered, as if life could be forced back into earth and wood by feeding them with what was warm and living. The advice is placed in a crisis story. A blight spreads across Ireland after a king enters a disastrous marriage with a woman from the other world. The narrative then shifts in a way that looks like a later softening of the older theme, because the human victim is replaced with a cow. The replacement feels like an attempt to keep the shape of the right while reducing its cruelty. The sort of change often introduced when older material is rewritten under new religious influence. Elsewhere, faint traces of older blood logic appear in custom rather than story. At Highland funerals in earlier times, friends of the dead were said to fight until blood was drawn. The act was not treated as random violence. Blood itself was considered necessary, as if something had to be offered to the newly dead, or as if the boundary between the living community and the person who had just crossed into death required a visible payment, read as a survival. Such fighting looks like a diluted remnant of a more explicit sacrifice once performed for the spirit of the departed. Some interpreters have argued that the priestly class did not invent human sacrifice at all, but merely permitted it, maintaining a practice that reached back into a prehistoric world. One argument insists that Ireland, often described as deeply shaped by Druid tradition, did not know human sacrifice, yet traditions and scattered references suggest that the idea of it did exist there, especially around the winter threshold. At the same time, not every grim story attached to early Ireland automatically belongs to Druid practice. A tale about children being offered to a stone idol at a famous ritual site may reflect an older or different religious layer, one whose earliest written account appears so late that it likely belongs to a period when the old priesthood was no longer firmly established, if it ever had been in that form at that place. If attention turns from humans to trees, another possibility emerges. It is hard to avoid the thought that in very early times, victims may have been offered to a sacred oak spirit. One famous description of a mistletoe ceremony presents it as a source of healing power, but the rite itself looks larger than medicine. Some observers have suggested that the scene as recorded is incomplete, because an empire that had already banned human sacrifice would have forced ritual communities to replace the old offering with animals. In that view, the oxen killed during the ceremony are not the original centre of the act, but a substitution. Even without that step, the evidence still supports an animal offering made directly to the oak. Across Europe, the cult of sacred trees leaves long footprints. In the 8th century, a Christian writer describes a revered oak at Geismar in Hesse where people sacrificed and sought omens, calling the tree by a name that linked it with thunder and divine authority. Centuries later, hunters in parts of Central Europe still placed first offerings of the chase on oaks. In the Baltic region, a forest sanctuary became legendary as the most sacred place in the land, with holy images set on an oak and cloths hung from its branches. Those cloths matter because they echo a pattern seen again and again. When a whole body is no longer offered, a part can stand in for the whole, and a strip of clothing becomes a token of surrender, a small substitute for what once might have been far greater. Earlier, Christian biographies also mention animal heads hung on trees, a detail that suggests how widespread sacrificial tree ritual once was. In some traditions, sacrifice to oak powers is tied directly to farming success and weather. Accounts speak of offerings made to oak trees for good harvests, and of dark animals given in times of drought to the thunder power that ruled rain and storm. The oak becomes more than a tree. It becomes a vessel of force, a living pole of the landscape that receives gifts when the land needs help. On the shores of Loch Maree in Scotland, a later version of this tree and offering world can still be glimpsed. A sacred well stands near an oak, and visitors drive nails and coins into the trunk. In older practice, each nail was once linked to a piece of clothing. Another example of substitution. A fragment offered in place of a person. Even the oak leaf takes on symbolic weight, treated as if it carries the tree's vitality. In the Roman world, an oak leaf wreath was a mark of heroic honour, and the motif survives in later military symbolism. Such details do not prove a direct line from one ritual system to another, but they show how the oak's sacred status could travel across centuries, in many different forms. When the focus shifts to animal sacrifice, the record becomes overwhelming in a different way. In Britain and Ireland, cattle offerings appear again and again, lingering into relatively late times. This persistence suggests a practice that was not accidental but inherited, passed down so long that it became embedded in habit. In parts of Wales, for example, bullocks were offered to a local saint even in the late 16th century, and a nearby sacred grove was treated as untouchable. The saint in question may hide an older figure beneath a Christian name because the stories attached to the place connect with cattle, appetite, and a larger-than-human presence. The pattern repeats elsewhere. Christian labels, older meanings. Medieval writers also record churchmen trying to stop the sacrifice of bulls. Later records describe bulls offered at a coastal shrine in the Highlands, to the scandal of religious authorities. These sacrifices were aimed not at abstract gods, but at a very practical fear. Cattle plague. The rites could include pouring milk on hills, and at least once a sacrifice was made in hope of restoring a sick woman. In the 18th and 19th centuries, stories continue. Cows offered to the spirit of disease, heifers burned alive as protection against plague, oxen sacrificed in rural parishes, and even a live cow burned in a kiln in the islands as an offering meant to turn sickness away. The method of lighting the need fire also stands out. Fire was drawn by friction from wood, and every other fire nearby might be extinguished, so that the new sacred flame became the only source. Smoke from that fire was then used to fumigate stalls. The logic points to cleansing, renewal, and exclusion of harmful powers. In that setting, the famous Beltane fires begin to look less like spectacle, and more like protection technology, a ritual barrier against the invisible threat of murrain. Driving cattle between two flames fits this pattern exactly. At an earlier stage, the animals may not only have been protected by fire, but offered through it. In many of these cases, the sacrifice functions like a transfer. One creature dies so the herd might live. A scape beast absorbs the danger and carries it away. Yet, an even older possibility sits behind that. The death of a special animal believed to embody the protective power of the group itself. In that older frame, the bull becomes more than livestock. It becomes the living symbol of a force tied to storm, fertility, and the sacred tree. Across the ancient world, thunder gods are compared to bulls, and gods linked with the oak take bovine form. Even English folk naming practices hint at this, where certain oaks are called bull oaks, linked by story with shelter during storms. If a bull spirit lived in the oak, then cattle sacrifice begins to look like communion with the tree's power. The record does not stop at animals. Legends suggest that, at moments of panic, a human life could be used as the ultimate cure. In one Highland story, a man is told that the heart of a person who does not know his parents must be dipped into water, and that the water sprinkled on the herd will drive the disease away. A travelling peddler becomes the victim. The cattle recover, but the sickness returns in another form, striking the household. Another tradition describes a tramp seized and bound at a ford, with cattle driven over his body until he dies. The shape of these stories matches a broader myth pattern found elsewhere, where a structure cannot stand or a crisis cannot end until blood is given, and the victim is often defined by isolation, stranger status, or missing lineage. Cattle and ritual do not only intersect through slaughter, they also appear through skins, smoke, and disguise. In a winter ceremony in Scotland, a strip of hide from a sheep or cow was set alight, and passed to family members to inhale, believed to drive spirits away. In some versions of the rite, a young procession carried the burning strip from house to house. A man wore a cowhide around his head and struck it with a stick as he moved. The gesture recalls older European practices where animal skins were worn as part of fertility and purification ceremonies. In the logic of sympathetic magic, wearing the skin is not costume. It is transformation. The wearer becomes, for a time, what the animal represents, drawing on its power. Early Christian church rules from England complain about people dressing in skins and masks around midwinter, imitating animals. The complaint itself reveals how common the practice must have been. In Highland, prophecy writes, a seer, wrapped in a bull's hide and slept, seeking visions. The detail that the hide came from a newly killed animal suggests that sacrifice and divination once belonged to the same act. Irish tradition preserves an even clearer version. A bull is killed, its hide spread out, and questions asked as if spirits will answer. The hide is described as a special tool for knowledge, and the technique appears echoed in Welsh story, where a dream comes to a hero sleeping on the skin of a heifer. Across these variations, the theme remains consistent. The bull's life, the bull's skin, and supernatural knowledge form a single chain. Masks and bull imagery survive in folk ritual too. In parts of southern England, a figure wore a wooden bull's head and sometimes an ox skin as part of local ceremony. In another procession connected with a famous legend, a character led the parade wearing a bull-headed mask. In witch trial stories, the Black Man is repeatedly described as taking the form of a bull or appearing like one. The pattern suggests not that people were inventing bulls at random, but that an older bovine deity, linked to fertility, storm, oak, and solar power, was being pushed into the role of the devil as the religious worldview changed. The old god is not erased. It is relabeled. From this world of sacrifice and symbolism, the story broadens to a mystery that still exists in living landscapes: the wild white cattle of Britain. These herds carry a peculiar fascination, as if they have been treated not only as rare animals, but as relics. Many prehistoric beasts vanished long ago, yet white cattle, primitive in type and isolated in scattered parks, were preserved with unusual care. The question is not only where they came from, but why they were guarded so jealously. Their protection often feels less like economics and more like inherited devotion, a kind of duty whose original reason has faded, but whose force remains. Historical references show that wild cattle survived into surprisingly late times. Forest laws speak of cattle living within the bounds of woodland, distinct from other wild beasts. Welsh law codes describe white cattle with red ears. Medieval writers mention wild bulls in English forests. In Scotland, early modern historians describe fierce white bulls in the Caledonian forest, animals with curling manes, intense fear of human presence, and almost impossible to capture alive. Stories from royal ceremonies describe hunts for wild bulls in parks, and later records speak of people being charged with destroying white cows and bulls, kept in a particular forest for many years, described as unmatched elsewhere in Britain. The outrage recorded in such documents hints at how valued these animals were. Certain famous herds became legendary. One in the policies near Hamilton lived in an old oak wood enclosure, with trees of enormous girth. 19th century observers described the animals as white with dark eyes and black features, some horned, some not, larger than common Highland cattle, shy yet dangerous when pursued. Other writers noted their strict herd behaviour, moving together, following a leader, hiding calves in thickets, returning to the same resting place at sunset, grazing in predictable paths at dawn. Similar herds existed elsewhere in Scotland, at Perthshire estates and at great castles, only to be dispersed or destroyed because their wildness made them hard to manage. In northern England, the most famous herd lived at Chillingham, deep in a rugged border landscape. Records place the park early in medieval times, and the herd is known to have existed for centuries. It survived even through violent border years, perhaps because its ferocity acted as its own protection. Descriptions emphasize the same features: white bodies, dark muzzles, coloured ears, pale horns tipped with black, occasional upright manes in bulls, and a strong claim that the breed represents a very ancient cattle type. Other herds existed in England as well, in parks formed from old forests, and folk belief attached omens to them, such as the birth of a dark calf, predicting death in the owning family. Many locations across England and Scotland are listed in older records as holding such herds, though most eventually vanished. A geographical pattern emerges from these locations. With few exceptions, the herds appear in regions that preserved Brythonic culture and the Old British language longer than most of the island, or in areas tied to ancient British kingdoms that resisted early Saxon expansion. In Scotland, many of the herd sites lie within the Old Kingdom of Strathclyde. In England, most lie inside territories that remained British in identity, well into historical times. The pattern does not prove a religious motive on its own, but it aligns with the wider observation that older Celtic ritual customs tended to linger longest, where Celtic identity persisted most strongly. If cattle sacrifice survived in those regions into late periods, it becomes reasonable to imagine what it looked like in an earlier, more openly pagan age. Animals intended for ritual use would not be chosen at random from ordinary stock. They would be kept in protected enclosures, reserved, watched, and selected as needed. Roman and Celtic accounts repeatedly associate sacrificial cattle with whiteness, a colour often treated as sacred. That raises a powerful possibility. The herds of white cattle preserved through centuries might be the last shadow of older sacred herds, first protected because they were inviolable, and later protected because tradition itself insisted on it, even after the original meaning had been forgotten. Several features of these herds support that kind of explanation. The whiteness is one. Another is the strict refusal, maintained over long periods, to mix these animals with ordinary breeds. Such careful protection requires more than casual preference. It suggests a rule carried forward, generation after generation, a rule that once had sacred force. Over time, sacred rules can become sentiment, but sentiment can be astonishingly powerful, especially when tied to heritage and identity. Many old ceremonies survive in communities long after their purpose is no longer understood, and the suggestion that they should be abandoned often triggers fierce resistance. The same logic can apply to animals. Owners may not be able to justify the cost or the inconvenience in practical terms, but they protect the herd because it feels unthinkable not to. For almost 300 years, a powerful belief has circulated among the public in Britain and beyond, that the great stone monuments of Western Europe were built by the Druids and served as their temples. Stone circles, solitary standing stones, cromlechs, and dolmens were all swept into this single explanation. The origin of this idea is not mysterious. It can be traced with some precision to early attempts to explain the purpose of Stonehenge. When interest in that monument reached the English court in the early modern period, official inquiries were set in motion. The reports that followed, speculative and incomplete, encouraged the suggestion that Druids had been responsible for its construction. From there, the leap was easy. If Stonehenge was Druidic, then every ancient stone monument could be imagined as part of the same religious system. One of the earliest figures to mention a Druidic link was Inigo Jones, a leading architect of his age. He raised the idea briefly and almost casually, which in itself shows how easily such notions can take root. Yet, he soon abandoned it. The next influential name was John Aubrey, who made a passing reference to Druids in connection with Stonehenge, in a later edition of a major historical survey. His more detailed thoughts on the subject were never fully published, and even in the fragments that survive, he treated the idea as little more than a tentative guess. He openly acknowledged how unlikely it might be. The notion gained greater strength in the early 18th century, when the first comprehensive English language work on Druids appeared. Its author gave fresh life to the belief that Druids were responsible for stone monuments, even while admitting that these priests were normally described as retreating into caves, forests, mountains, and groves rather than stone-built sanctuaries. The decisive moment, however, came later in that century. Popular works devoted to Stonehenge and Avebury, written with enthusiasm that far exceeded caution, captured the public imagination. Their influence was immense. From that point onward, the idea of stone circles as Druidic temples hardened into apparent fact for a wide audience. As the years passed, the story expanded. It was carried from place to place by amateur antiquarians and curious travellers, both eager to add meaning to the ruins they encountered. In doing so, they unintentionally created layers of invented tradition. By the early 19th century, the belief had embedded itself deeply in rural thinking and proved resistant to correction. Versions of it survived well into modern times, sometimes repeated even by official guides at famous sites. The result was unfortunate. Genuine traditions that might hint at real Druidic practices were drowned in exaggeration, and the very word Druid became suspect among professional archaeologists, who associated it with uncritical speculation rather than evidence. A similar process unfolded in France, where the stone monuments of Brittany were confidently described as Druidic in early 19th century publications. When attention turns away from popular legend and toward ancient testimony, a different picture emerges. Classical writers are remarkably consistent in their descriptions of where Druids actually practiced their rites. Their sanctuaries were not stone-built temples, but natural settings, above all groves. One Roman poet addresses the Druids as inhabitants of the deepest forests. Another writer states plainly that they chose oak groves for worship. Accounts of ritual violence carried out by a British queen describe sacrifices taking place in a sacred wood. A Roman historian speaks of the groves of an island off the Welsh coast as places devoted to terrifying rites. Across these sources, the setting remains the same: trees, not stones. Early Irish tradition reinforces this impression. Sacred groves are repeatedly mentioned as places of ritual importance. Scholars have pointed out that before the 17th century, no one appears to have imagined Druids worshipping anywhere else. The very word used for a sanctuary among Celtic-speaking peoples originally meant a sacred wooded space. In parts of Asia Minor, Celtic groups established their central council at a site whose name clearly identified it as a great sacred grove. In Gaul, nearly every tribe seems to have possessed such a place, combining religious ritual with the administration of justice. Even early medieval church lists of forbidden practices mention shrines in groves, suggesting how persistent these traditions were. Modern scholarship on ancient Celtic religion emphasizes that sacred places were often defined by ritual boundaries rather than walls. Offerings were left in open areas, in forests, or in wetlands. Some gods were associated with entire forests, others with individual trees or small clusters. While different peoples emphasized different natural features, forests and trees were central across much of the Celtic world. Later, folklore in Scotland preserves echoes of this reverence. Certain groves inspired fear and respect until relatively recent times, and stories persist of woods whose branches were never to be cut. The term used for such sacred trees survives in Gaelic place names, and records show that destroying them could incur enormous fines even in the medieval period. In England, too, tradition occasionally points to ancient groves. A small woodland on Dartmoor, long regarded locally as the descendant of a Druid grove, was shown by documentary evidence to have remained largely unchanged since before the Norman conquest. The trees were stunted oaks, lending weight to the idea that this was not just romantic invention, but a memory rooted in real continuity. Children's games can also preserve fragments of older ritual. On the Isle of Man, a game once played involved fixing a crude human figure to a cross and throwing sticks at it, while chanting verses that mention a small wood nearby. Earlier explanations tried to link the name of the figure to a foreign god from biblical tradition, but linguistic evidence points instead to a native deity. The reference to the little wood suggests a sacred grove, and the act of throwing sticks recalls older rites involving ritual killing by projectiles. The game appears less like idle play and more like a faded shadow of sacrificial practice. One site complicates the picture. The place now called Woodhenge, discovered through aerial photography near Stonehenge. Here, a large circular ditch encloses rings of holes that once held wooden posts. Some scholars have suggested that this represents an artificial grove, constructed where trees were scarce. Its date places it within the Iron Age, overlapping with the period when Druids are known to have existed. It may represent a transition between natural groves and later built sanctuaries, or even a model that influenced stone construction. A similar timber circle has been found near Norwich, associated with a region whose local goddess was known to have a sacred grove in the area of what later became London. Descriptions of a major sacred grove near a Mediterranean port city present it as a place of dread. The poet who describes it emphasizes darkness, blood, and fear, noting that even priests approached with caution. While poetic exaggeration must be allowed for, the account comes from a writer living close in time to the last Druids, and it reinforces the central theme. Druidic ritual belonged to forests, not stone circles. This brings the discussion to the stone monuments themselves. Were they built by Druids? The problem of dating them has never been fully resolved. Most are classed broadly as belonging to the New Stone Age or the Early Bronze Age, a span that covers thousands of years. Influences from the Mediterranean appear to have reached Western Europe around the middle of the 3rd millennium before the present era, and new burial forms followed. Later groups introduced additional stone circles. Stonehenge itself is a complex structure built in stages over a long period. Excavation has shown that many stone circles were associated with burials, but this does not mean burial was their only function. Chronology alone creates a major difficulty for the Druid theory. Even the latest phase of Stonehenge is likely far older than the earliest written reference to Druids. That gap makes a direct connection improbable. Some researchers, however, have argued for a much later date for Stonehenge, placing it within the Iron Age. They point to construction techniques that resemble those of classical architecture and suggest outside influence. If this dating were correct, Stonehenge would fall within the era of active Druidism, making some level of Druidic use possible. Yet even in this view, Stonehenge is understood as a monument built over generations, incorporating elements of very different ages. One striking feature of Stonehenge is the group of smaller stones brought from distant western hills. Geological analysis has shown that they originated in a specific region, far from the site. This implies deliberate transport over great distances. One interpretation sees these stones as carrying ancestral significance, embodying the spirits or protective powers of an earlier homeland. In this view, the monument was adapted to receive them, not created from nothing in a single moment. Medieval legend, which tells of magical transport of stones from across the sea, may preserve a distorted memory of such an event. Popular belief long held that these stones possessed healing power, a belief echoed in folk traditions surrounding standing stones elsewhere. As for the rituals performed at stone circles, a plausible interpretation sees them as places associated with the dead. Standing stones may have represented ancestors, later elevated into gods. Traditional names that describe such stones as transformed people, or as dwellings of spirits, support this idea. Over time, ancestor worship merged with beliefs about fertility and growth. The dead were imagined as powers beneath the earth, guiding crops and herds. Once agriculture became central to life, these sites took on seasonal importance, helping communities mark the right times for planting and harvest through simple observation of the sun's movement. At this stage, additional stones were sometimes positioned to indicate key points in the solar year. These markers did not require advanced astronomy. They served practical needs tied to farming and festival timing. The similarity between reverence for stones and reverence for trees is striking. Both were thought to house life-giving forces. In that sense, stone worship and tree worship may represent parallel expressions of the same underlying belief, rather than separate systems. Modern scholars tend to agree on one central point. Most stone circles were built long before Druids appear in historical sources. This does not exclude the possibility that Druids later used some of them. Monuments can outlive their builders and be reinterpreted by later cultures. It is likely that certain circles remained active places of gathering into the Iron Age, and that Druids, as religious specialists of that later period, made use of them. But the idea that Druids were the original builders finds little solid support. Some earlier scholars argued passionately that Druids must have been responsible, reasoning that only a powerful priesthood could have organised such labour. Others suggested that stone circles were built by later Celtic-speaking peoples, rather than Bronze Age communities. Still, others dismissed Druidic involvement entirely. The debate has been long and often shaped by the assumptions of its time. It is entirely possible that, in the later life of Celtic religion, true temples began to appear in the strict sense of the word. Enclosed buildings with walls and a roof, designed as permanent sacred spaces. The strongest likelihood is that most of these were built in an era when Roman power and Roman habits had already reshaped local worship. Communities living near the Latin world would have encountered the idea first. A Greek historian writing in the 2nd century, before the Common Era, describes Celtic groups in northern Italy honouring a goddess he equates with Athena. Language that suggests a more formalised cult than a simple outdoor rite. Roman authors also mention neighbouring peoples keeping war spoils inside a dedicated sanctuary. An image that implies a constructed religious building rather than a clearing in the woods. In Gaul itself, the picture seems different. Before Roman rule tightened its grip, the evidence for widespread roofed temples is thin. Many scholars have argued that the temples and altars clearly identifiable in the archaeological record belong overwhelmingly to the period of the Roman Empire. In that world, Roman planners, builders, and religious officials arrived with a standard toolkit: the familiar temple layout, the altar in front, and the public ritual style that came with it. that does not mean local identity vanished. Some sanctuaries in Gaul follow architectural patterns that are not typical of Mediterranean classical design, including a notable preference for square plans. A form like that may preserve a native habit of sacred space-making even if the building itself was razed during the Roman centuries. There remains room for a limited exception. Even in the Age of Independence, a few enclosed shrines may have existed, likely built in timber and therefore less visible to later archaeology. Ancient writers occasionally speak of treasure gathered in temples and sacred places, but such phrases can be misleading. A sacred place does not automatically mean a stone building. Offerings could be collected and displayed in groves, on trees, or in other natural sanctuaries. Later British writers, describing a landscape after Roman withdrawal, refer to abandoned temples where grim idols still stood. The description does not fit refined Roman art particularly well and may instead point to local shrines and native images that endured outside the official Roman aesthetic. One place repeatedly drawn into this discussion is the region later dominated by Chartres. A Roman commander describes a central gathering point for Druids in Gaul, a consecrated area regarded as the heart of the country. Traditions later placed this meeting ground at or near Chartres, sometimes shifting it toward neighbouring districts. Over time, local stories grew around the cathedral, claims that it rose on the site of an older Celtic sanctuary, that a dark, sacred image once stood there and was later replaced, and that underground spaces beneath the church had been revered long before Christianity. Some versions push the setting toward a dramatic wilderness of dense woods, a romantic picture that matches modern imagination more than hard proof. Other ancient testimony is less theatrical but still suggestive. One classical author says Druid teaching took place in caves or secluded valleys, places chosen for privacy and separation rather than monumental architecture. When the evidence is weighed as a whole, the older stone circles appear to belong to a world far earlier than Druidism as it is historically described. Yet it remains plausible that Druids, living in a later age, sometimes used these ancient monuments. That kind of reuse is common in religious history. Old sacred places rarely lose their power overnight. From the standpoint of belief and ritual pattern, the overlap is striking. The ceremonies imagined at stone circles look, in their broad logic, like close relatives of later Celtic religious themes. The older megalithic religion, as far as it can be outlined, seems to have centered on the dead and on forces of fertility. Ancestors were not merely remembered, they were treated as active powers tied to crops, herds, and human life. Standing stones could function as visible bodies for these unseen presences. In the later Celtic world, sacred trees played a similar role. The oak, above all, is repeatedly treated as a giver of food and fuel, a living reservoir of power. In both systems, the sacred object is not just symbolic, it is imagined as inhabited. A pillar has a spirit, a tree has a spirit. The practical purpose is the same, to secure the life of the community by maintaining contact with forces believed to govern growth and abundance. That similarity does not mean the stone monuments were a Druid creation. In many regions where an oak-centered cult later became dominant, stone monuments appear to belong to an earlier layer of sacred geography. The two may have existed side by side for centuries, perhaps in different zones, perhaps serving different communities, perhaps representing different stages of the same broad religious imagination. A forested landscape naturally favours a religion expressed through trees. A more open landscape may favour stone markers that endure when wood does not. A broader scenario can be sketched. A cult focused on the oak makes the most sense in regions where oak forests were extensive and long-lasting, where generations depended on that tree not only for timber and fuel, but also for food in lean times. Over time, reliance becomes reverence, and reverence hardens into ritual. From a centre of strong oak ecology, such a cult could spread outward into Gaul and beyond. Environmental history supports the idea that the oak arrived later in parts of northern Europe than several other trees, and that shifts in climate and storm patterns changed forest cover dramatically in places like Britain. But once oak woodlands established themselves, the conditions for an oak-centred religious system became stronger, and the beliefs that later observers would label Druidism could find fertile ground. At this point, the story turns toward a second pillar of interpretation: divine kingship. Again and again, hints appear that Druid authority and royal authority were not separate worlds but intertwined powers. The key idea is simple, and it appears in many cultures. The king is not merely a political leader, he is treated as a living channel of fertility. Good harvests, healthy herds, and general prosperity are imagined as flowing from the vitality of the ruler. In Egypt, royal ideology made this connection explicit. The king was represented as the son of the sun, and in some formulations as the sun god's earthly form. His strength was thought to sustain the order of nature. When the Nile flooded on time, when grain ripened, when livestock multiplied, the explanation was not only practical, it was personal. The ruler's sacred force was still working. That belief carried an implicit danger. If crops failed or the land suffered, the king's power could be questioned. Traditions from different societies suggest that early systems sometimes managed this tension through replacement, sacrifice, or ritual renewal of kingship. Even when literal killing disappeared, the logic remained. The ruler had to be renewed, confirmed, or ritually recharged, because the kingdom's life was thought to depend on it. Across the Indo-European world, comparable ideas appear. Irish tradition, in particular, repeatedly insists that the king's right conduct ensures mild seasons and plentiful yield. The ruler is depicted as holding the land together, not only by law but by sacred correctness. In the earliest phase, kings often perform priestly duties themselves, because the boundary between political leadership and religious function is barely visible. In later phases, a distinct priesthood emerges, but it stays close to the throne. Even in Rome, when monarchy ended, a special priestly office survived to perform rites, once tied to the king's sacred role, a sign that the religious meaning of kingship outlived the institution itself. In the Celtic world, this pattern helps explain the prominence of Druids. Rather than being isolated mystics on the edge of society, they appear in many accounts as central advisors and ritual specialists closely connected with rulers. The relationship is often described as more than advisory. A Greek writer around the 1st century of the Common Era portrays Druids as the people whose counsel kings could not ignore, to the point that the real power seemed to reside with the religious experts rather than with the rulers who wore crowns and sat in splendour. Irish narrative traditions echo the same hierarchy. A king may be surrounded by officials, yet the Druids' precedence is emphasised in scenes of council, prophecy, or public decision. This closeness raises a provocative possibility. In early stages, priest and king may have been fused in one role, especially if the sacred duty involved guarding and directing the fertility rites of the community. Later, as societies became more complex, the roles could separate, leaving kings who ruled and priests who managed the sacred mechanisms that justified rule. Some traditions even describe Druid kings, figures who carried both authorities at once, suggesting that the boundary remained flexible in certain times and places. Irish material also contains one of the most telling features of divine kingship systems: rotation and limitation. Stories speak of rulers holding power for a fixed term, as if the strain of being the land's sacred engine could exhaust a human being. Other narratives describe hostages and severe penalties tied to royal duty, implying that kingship was a contract with supernatural consequences, not merely a political arrangement. Behind these themes lies an older logic found elsewhere. If the king's strength fails, the land fails, and something drastic must restore balance. Seen from this angle, Druidism and divine kingship reinforce each other. A fertility-centered religion needs a focal point through which the land's vitality is believed to flow. A sacred monarchy needs ritual experts who can define taboos, supervise inaugurations, interpret omens, and protect the ruler's charge status. In that partnership, the king becomes more than a ruler, and the druid becomes more than a priest. The king embodies the land's life, and the druid manages the conditions under which that embodiment remains effective. In the older Irish tradition, a bad harvest was never treated as a simple accident of weather. When crops failed and hunger followed, responsibility drifted upward until it settled on the ruler himself. The king was imagined as more than an administrator of laws and battles. His body, his conduct, and even the way he was treated by others were believed to touch the living nerve of the land. If the king was dishonoured or harmed, the fields were expected to suffer. If rebellion or internal violence broke the social order, the soil was thought to answer back with scarcity. Stories set in the early centuries of Irish kingship make this idea vivid. One tradition describes a time when subordinate clans rose against a high ruler and violence followed, including the killing of a regional king. Soon after, famine is said to have spread. The explanation offered in the tale is not agricultural mismanagement or a run of bad seasons, but moral and ritual imbalance. The people are told that the earth has withdrawn its generosity because a sacred boundary was crossed through that killing. In another famous example, a ruler remembered as unjust presides over a land that becomes almost sterile. Grain does not fill the ear, acorns do not form on the oak, nuts do not appear on the hazel. The image is extreme on purpose. It turns the whole natural world into a verdict against the king. By contrast, accounts of a good king describe streams heavy with fish, stores full, calm weather, and a sense that nature itself has become cooperative. The same body of tradition goes further and insists that the king's physical condition mattered. A ruler marked by injury, deformity, or visible flaw could be judged unfit, not only because such signs were socially unsettling, but because they were treated as signals that his sacred capacity had been compromised. The land, in this view, demanded wholeness. It also demanded a partner in rule who met the same invisible standard. The queen was not just a companion at court. She carried her own moral and ritual weight, and some traditions even claim that she had religious advisors attached specifically to her household. If the royal marriage went wrong, the result could be read as an agricultural disaster. One tale concentrates that fear into a single dramatic year. A king is said to prosper with a virtuous queen. After her death, he takes a bride described as a woman of the other world. During the period they live together, the normal outputs of life fail. Grain disappears, milk runs dry, and the country feels as though it has been unplugged from its source of nourishment. The story, then, introduces an older pattern found in many cultures: the search for a life to offer in order to restore balance. The tradition implies that a human victim was sought, yet the narrative shifts and substitutes an animal instead, as if later retellings struggled with the starkness of the original idea. Such accounts fit a larger belief that the king's words themselves could alter fertility. Judgment was not simply a legal act. It was a force that could either steady the world or poison it. A ruler famed for wisdom may still be barred from speaking in certain moments because a single false verdict is imagined to ripple outward into the harvest. In a society that ties prosperity to sacred order, truth in judgment becomes a kind of rainfall. Error becomes drought. In that atmosphere, the king is watched not only for political decisions, but for the purity of his role. Behind these stories lies a darker possibility that appears again and again in world folklore. The idea that rulers might be removed, even killed, when their strength waned. When kingship is treated as the engine of abundance, frailty becomes dangerous. A line survives in Irish tradition, in which a king remarks that if he falls, it will be for the saving of many. It reads like a personal lament, yet it also sounds like a memory of an older logic, the belief that one life might be exchanged for the life of the land. At the same time, the king in these traditions is not imagined as acting alone. The invisible mechanism is often managed by a learned, priestly class. In several narratives, religious specialists identify the moral cause of famine, interpret signs, and prescribe what must be done to reopen the flow of fertility. The relationship is presented as intimate. Rulers depend on them for legitimacy, for interpretation, and for the ritual language that translates public crisis into a story the people can understand. This world of sacred kingship is repeatedly linked to trees. Older belief held that spirits associated with certain trees could bring crops to fullness. Over centuries, those tree spirits were elevated into greater gods, including figures later identified with thunder and the oak. Mediterranean examples show the same pattern. A god who begins as the power inside a tree becomes the ruler of storms and the sky. Myth does not stay small. It expands. And kings, eager to appear as the living counterpart of that power, sometimes imitate the god's work. Ancient stories describe rulers staging thunder-like sounds or rain-making gestures as public demonstrations that they can still move fertility, at least symbolically. In Irish tradition, a ruler's life can be tied to a particular sacred tree. The idea is not merely poetic. The tree functions as an external anchor of vitality, a living sign that the king's fate is bound to something older than himself. In some versions, the tree is also a doorway for ancestry. A spirit linked to the tribe is imagined as dwelling in the tree until the time comes to be reborn among humans. The sacred tree becomes a storehouse of continuity, a bridge between the dead and the living, and a symbol that kingship is not simply inherited through politics, but renewed through a cycle of spiritual return. Across the Celtic world, even group names hint at how deeply trees and identity were intertwined. Some peoples appear in ancient sources with names that can be read as references to yew or mistletoe. That kind of naming suggests more than casual symbolism. It hints at social groups who define themselves through sacred vegetation, almost as if a people could be the yew folk or the mistletoe folk. In the same way, another people might be known by a river or a mountain. In such a landscape, the priestly specialist associated with the oak may once have been understood not only as a religious figure, but as the representative of a tree-defined community. Kingship, in this framework, is also acted out through marriage. The royal bed is not only personal, it becomes a ritual engine. Some traditions describe seasonal ceremonies in which the ruler joins with a woman who represents the land itself. The union is staged as a symbolic joining of sun and soil, power and territory, ruler and realm. The message is blunt and practical. The country becomes fertile because the king has completed the act that binds him to it. The marriage is not romance, it is a contract with nature. A striking parallel appears in Italy, where a sacred grove was guarded by a priestly king whose role depended on violent succession. A challenger could only fight him after taking a branch from a particular tree in the grove. Victory meant the office, and the office meant power over fertility within that sacred landscape. Roman writers describe the goddess of that grove not only as a guardian of wild places, but as a giver of fruitfulness to fields and people. In some accounts, a ritual union took place there as well, with a human enactment of the goddess's role. The branch, taken as a sign of challenge and legitimacy, becomes an emblem of sanctioned power. Celtic tradition does not preserve the same ritual in the same clear form, yet echoes appear in unexpected places. A Welsh poem describes a figure linked to Merlin guarding a tree in a wild forest, armed and watchful, as if fulfilling an obligation to a female spirit connected with the tree. The mood is tense and haunted, closer to a sacred duty than to a heroic adventure. The resemblance to the Italian grove is not exact, but the structure feels familiar. A man tied to kingship-like authority, a woman representing a divine or territorial presence, and a guarded tree that anchors the whole relationship. Another claim, argued by some scholars of early Ireland, is that high kingship at Tara could be imagined as a chain of succession secured through killing the predecessor. Later, storytellers tried to explain this as ordinary revenge or feuding, yet the pattern looks ritualized in outline. The successor proves fitness through violence, and the transfer of power is treated as a transformation rather than a mere political change. Critics have argued that these king lists and the killings attached to them are artificial, invented to dramatize dynastic rivalry. Yet the persistence of tree-linked kingship motifs and guarded tree stories suggests that the older ritual imagination may have been nearer the surface than later rational explanations admit. The same worldview appears in the strange tests that tradition attaches to royal inauguration. A candidate is brought to stones that behave like judges. If the future king is accepted, the stones open or allow passage. If rejected, they close or block him. The story is foggy on details, as such stories often are, but its purpose is clear. The land itself, represented by immovable stone, must consent. Passing between stones is not treated as a simple physical feat. It carries the flavour of symbolic rebirth. The candidate emerges on the far side as a different kind of person, no longer merely a man, but a ruler invested with the land's permission. A second and even more famous object appears at Tara, a stone that cries out when the rightful king stands upon it. In one legend, a king goes at sunrise to survey the sky with advisors and poets, as if guarding the realm against threats not only from enemies, but from the unseen world above. He steps on a stone and it gives a loud cry, so strong that it is said to be heard across the royal centre and beyond. The advisors debate the meaning for a long time, as if the omen is too heavy to interpret quickly. At last, the verdict is delivered. The cry reveals legitimate kingship. Later speculation tried to explain the sound as a concealed device, a ritual noisemaker used to produce awe. Whether that is plausible or not, the story's intention is unmistakable. The stone is not decoration. It is a living witness, a voice for the realm, an object believed to hold a protective presence tied to sovereignty. Even outside Ireland, fragments of the same logic appear. A medieval romance about a wasted land tells of a country that once offered food and welcome to travellers, through mysterious women linked to springs. A king commits an offence against one of these beings and steals a sacred object, and from that moment, the springs dry up, grass withers, and the land falls into barrenness. The wrongdoing is not simply punished with personal tragedy, it is punished with ecological collapse. The king's moral failure becomes the land's physical failure. The tale is framed as chivalric fantasy, yet the structure is old. A ruler violates a sacred relationship with the land's guardians, and fertility withdraws. Taken together, these stories build a consistent picture. Sacred kingship in this tradition is always tied to fertility. It stands close to priestly authority because the mechanisms that link ruler to land are managed through ritual knowledge. It aligns easily with solar imagery because sun and growth are the most obvious natural partners, and later, religious systems often merge older, tree-centered ideas into a broader sky and sun theology. It allows for priest kings and for kings who cannot act without priestly sanction. It ties royal fate to sacred trees whose lives mirror the king's own, and it stages royal legitimacy through tests that treat stones, trees, and omens as if they can accept or reject a human being. This is why the fusion between the religious specialists and the institution of kingship becomes so hard to pull apart in the Irish material. When prosperity, justice, ritual correctness, and the vitality of the ruler are imagined as one system, separating the priestly order from sovereignty is not a minor reform. It becomes a rupture that threatens both. A religion built around fertility needs an embodied centre, and a kingship justified through sacred vitality needs expert guardians of the rites and taboos that keep that vitality intact. In that mutual dependence, the king and the religious class become two halves of a single engine. From there, a final layer enters the story: outside influences and later religious change. Earlier scholars often tried to explain Celtic religion by tracing it back to the east, building confident comparisons with Indian priests, Persian magi, or other distant traditions. Much of that older approach grew from a period that loved grand migration stories and sweeping family trees of civilization. The comparisons were sometimes clever, often overreaching, and frequently shaped by the assumptions of their time rather than by solid evidence. Yet one Eastern cult did spread across the Roman world in a way that can be documented more securely. A Persian-rooted mystery religion centered on a solar god gained popularity, especially among soldiers, and it established itself in many provinces of the empire. In Britain, carvings and reliefs show the god killing a bull, a scene loaded with the idea that life is renewed through sacrifice. Such images have been found in major Roman centres and along military zones. The cult met in underground chambers or cave-like shrines, guarded its ceremonies with secrecy, and organised initiation through ranks. It appealed strongly to male groups, bound by discipline and loyalty, which helps explain why it travelled so effectively with the army. The details of its rituals are partly lost, but certain elements are described in surviving sources and later references. Shared meals of simple foods, washings or baptisms connected with purification, and a dramatic focus on the bull as the carrier of vitality. The bull's death is presented not as a random offering, but as a cosmic act, renewing fertility and promising salvation. When such a cult appears in a region where older traditions already associate bulls with sacred power and fertility, it is easy to see how a worn or fragmentary local religion might be tempted to treat the new cult as familiar rather than alien. Similar symbols can create the illusion of kinship, even when the underlying theology differs. Some writers imagine that this mystery cult gave new life to late pagan traditions in Britain, especially in an era when Christianity had already gained ground. They pictured a hybrid mixture: old native survivals, Roman mystery practices, and later, ceremonial brotherhoods folded into one. That claim is difficult to prove in a strict sense. What can be said with more confidence is that late literature and later legends sometimes preserve hints of ideas that feel like they belong to a world of mystery initiations and symbolic solar power. Even so, connecting those hints directly to an intact, original Druidic system is a different matter. The more cautious reading is that later centuries produced mixtures and echoes, rather than a clean continuation. The arrival of Christianity, especially in Ireland and the North, is often romanticised as a peaceful handover. Some older writers like to claim that native religious specialists welcomed the new faith as if it were the completion of their own expectations. The traditions themselves often present the opposite mood. Stories about early missionaries depict confrontations, contest of power, and a struggle over who possesses the stronger spell, meaning the stronger sacred authority. In this kind of narrative, victory comes not through abstract doctrine, but through visible signs, persuasive miracles, and a direct contest of ritual competence. Over time, the boundary blurs. Missionaries adapt to the landscape they enter. They learn which customs cannot be shattered in one blow, and which symbols can be redirected. Observers later remark that Christianity was laid over older habits, with such skill that many people crossed into the new world without feeling the full distance they had travelled. The saints begin to look, in popular imagination, like more powerful versions of the old holy specialists. The new faith gains ground partly because it speaks the same language of power, protection, and wonder, only with different names and a different sacred centre. Accounts of Columba's encounters with the Druids of northern Britain describe not a simple clash of beliefs, but a prolonged contest of sacred power set against sacred power. In these stories, prayer confronts spell, blessing answers curse, and authority is measured by visible effect rather than abstract doctrine. In the same tradition, many early Celtic saints appear less like figures of a wholly new religion and more like older, divine beings recast in Christian form. Names, functions, and attributes carry unmistakable traces of pre-Christian origins. One saint emerges directly from heroic saga. Another mirrors a well-known goddess so closely that the claim of two separate historical figures sounds more like a theological convenience than a conclusion drawn from tradition. From the perspective of folklore, the continuity is far stronger than the division. A striking legend from the Channel Islands illustrates how these transitions were imagined at the local level. In Guernsey, a story is told of an arch-druid, remembered as the last open opponent of Christianity. After his companions accepted the new faith, he withdrew in anger to a cave on a remote headland, spending long hours staring out across the sea. When a violent storm threatened to smash a ship against the rocks below him, he first appealed to his traditional gods. But no help came. In desperation, he turned instead to the Christian god, promising that if the ship was saved, he would convert and dedicate a chapel to the Virgin. The storm broke, the ship reached safety, and the Druid fulfilled his vow. The tale does not present conversion as an intellectual shift, but as a practical decision driven by the perceived effectiveness of one power over another. Irish tradition preserves a similar sense that the coming of Christianity was neither unexpected nor entirely foreign. A well-known hymn places prophetic words in the mouths of Druids, foretelling a time when their own centres would fall silent and a new order would take hold. Later, writers notice something curious in the language attributed to these figures. Phrases and ideas that suggest familiarity with Christian ritual, even before its formal arrival. Historical records confirm that Christian communities existed in Ireland, before the mission traditionally associated with Patrick, making it difficult to argue that the religious specialists of the island were ignorant of the new faith. On the contrary, they appear to have known it well enough to recognise its challenge. From this awareness arose a theory that certain religious communities in Ireland and Scotland represented a hybrid stage rather than a clean break. These groups, often referred to as servants of God, were believed by some to have emerged directly from the older priestly class, adopting Christian teaching while retaining elements of earlier practice. Traces of them appear in Scotland and Ireland from the early medieval period, living ascetic lives, sometimes alone, sometimes in small communities. Their rituals did not always align with Roman custom, and their practices drew criticism from church councils and bishops who viewed them as irregular or even heretical. These communities persisted for centuries, appearing in important ecclesiastical centres and surviving long enough to be mentioned in legal and administrative documents well into the early modern period. Over time, the term used for them shifted in meaning, eventually becoming little more than a title for a church official. Opinions about them varied sharply. Some dismissed them as degenerate monks. Others saw them as representatives of an independent Celtic Christian tradition that resisted outside authority. Harsh judgments from later churchmen accused them of barbarism and lingering paganism, including the serious charge that they rejected clerical celibacy. Yet such accusations reveal as much about the fears and assumptions of their critics as about the communities themselves. Behind these disputes lies a larger irony. Religious systems that denounce pagan survivals often carry within themselves ideas and practices inherited from far older traditions. What is condemned as superstition in one context may be quietly preserved in another under a new name. The inability of later observers to recognize this continuity has led to some of the most passionate misunderstandings in religious history. When attention turns specifically to the magical arts associated with the Druids, it becomes clear that the term magic must be handled carefully. Classical writers frequently linked the Druids with occult knowledge, yet the word used to describe them often meant wise, rather than sorcerer. Their reputation rested less on crude spellcasting and more on mastery of signs, interpretation of omens, and deep familiarity with ritual knowledge. Later folklore, especially after the suppression of the formal Druidic order, tended to blur this distinction, assigning to them feats closer to those of wandering conjurers and village witches. Early Irish literature is saturated with references to Druids as wielders of extraordinary power. They raise fogs to hide armies, summon storms to block invasions, and cloak landscapes in darkness. When opposing forces possessed similar specialists, these effects could be countered, turning battles into contests of invisible skill as much as physical strength. Snowfall, darkness, drought, and flood all appear as weapons in this unseen war. In some stories, a single druid can deprive an entire region of water, only to restore it by striking the earth with a projectile charged with ritual intent. Christian hagiography absorbed many of these motifs and reshaped them. Narratives describing confrontations between missionaries and druids often read like ritual duels. Fire is challenged by fire, winter by blessing, ordeal by ordeal. Victory is demonstrated not through debate, but through survival, endurance, and visible control over the elements. The structure of these stories suggests continuity in expectations. Holiness proves itself by power. Other tales push druidic magic into stranger territory. A queen seeking an heir drinks a consecrated liquid prepared by a religious specialist and gives birth first to an animal, then to a human child after further ritual intervention. Such stories are not meant to shock, but to emphasize the perceived potency of ritual knowledge when directed at fertility and lineage. Among the tools associated with Druidic practice, the wand or branch occupies a central place. Made from sacred trees, often yew, oak, hawthorn, or rowan, it functions as a symbol of authority and a channel of power. Sometimes it carries small bells, sometimes it resembles a crescent-shaped branch. Its purpose is not merely decorative. When raised, it can still a battlefield, impose peace, or enforce judgment. Literary sources distinguish between branches of different metals carried by poets of varying rank, reinforcing the idea that the object signified status as well as function. Transformation is another recurring theme. Druids are said to change their own shape or the appearance of others, turning people into animals, disguising themselves to deceive heroes, or altering the substance of the world around them. Children become birds, women become deer. Stones conceal human forms. These transformations are not presented as illusions in the theatrical sense, but as genuine alterations imposed by will and ritual skill. In some later traditions, stones along the coast or in the countryside are said to be enchanted druids themselves, trapped in material form yet still dangerous to the living. Certain spells are described as capable of rendering armies invisible or surrounding them with barriers that cannot be crossed without fatal consequence. Others induce madness through the throwing of a small enchanted object, a wisp of straw or grass charged with intention. Words themselves carry force. Satire is not merely insult, but an act capable of disfigurement, sickness, or death. Poets fast, chant, and align themselves with landscape features to direct this power, accepting the risk that if they are wrong, the earth itself will swallow them. Learned masters gathered young aristocrats around them and taught everything they believed about the world, the soul, and the gods. Those who aimed for religious office stayed longest and received the most concentrated attention. The system may not have looked like a classroom, but it still functioned as an educational network tied to prestige and authority. The question of colleges is where imagination often runs ahead of evidence. Some writers have pictured a fully structured academic system with buildings, ranks, examinations, and degrees, almost like a monastery or a medieval university. The older sources do not require that. They speak, instead of secluded instruction, of groups formed around teachers and of communities that could appear wherever learning was concentrated. Irish chronicles mention places whose names imply gatherings of learned people, and later Christian sites are sometimes said to stand on older sacred centres, including places where a holy fire was maintained by women before the rise of the church. It is difficult to tell how much of this reflects real continuity and how much reflects later storytelling that tries to give ancient roots to sacred landscapes. Traditions about colleges of priestesses at various mounds and hills often feel especially late and decorative because they appear alongside confident claims about caves and hidden chambers that cannot be dated by the tradition itself. Welsh material adds another layer of confusion. A shadowy brotherhood associated with secret books, unusual arts, and a hidden stronghold on a mountain appears in scattered references. Some later writers inflate these hints into the claim that such a group maintained a college centuries before Oxford existed, which is clearly the kind of assertion that grows when legend is repeated often enough to acquire a false solidity. The most that can be said is that Welsh tradition preserved the idea of arcane specialists and secret knowledge, sometimes linked to technical skill, such as metalworking. Connecting that directly to Druids is much harder, and the safest approach is to treat it as a parallel stream of myth-making, rather than clear evidence of a Druid institution. Another puzzle concerns writing. Caesar famously says that sacred teaching was not written down, and yet he also notes that Druids could use the Greek alphabet for practical purposes. Irish stories go farther and portray Druids reading Ogham inscriptions, leaving messages in Ogham and being called upon as the only people able to interpret such markings when others could not. This sits uneasily beside the image of a purely oral system. The tension may be resolved by a simple distinction. Certain kinds of knowledge could be written, while the most valued teachings were deliberately kept in memory and performance. Later, Christian tradition tells dramatic stories of large-scale book burnings, where Druid texts are destroyed as part of a campaign against pagan learning. The numbers given in these tales vary wildly, and the tone is often rhetorical, designed to display zeal rather than to record an inventory. Still, the persistence of the theme suggests that early Christian writers wanted their audience to believe that a rival intellectual tradition had been defeated not only in debate, but also by the elimination of its written traces. In some narratives, even a public contest is staged in which sacred books are thrown into water, and the book that remains readable is treated as proof of religious truth. The point of such scenes is not the realism of the test, but the symbolism. Authority is granted to the tradition that can survive the trial. Beyond teaching, the Druids are repeatedly shown as judges. Caesar's description is detailed. They handle disputes in both public and private life, from crimes and murders to inheritance and boundary conflicts. They assign penalties and rewards, and they hold a power that reaches beyond law into ritual. Anyone who refuses to accept a judgment can be barred from sacrifice, a punishment described as the harshest available, because it turns a person into an outsider in both religion and society. Those who are excluded are shunned, treated as polluted, and denied access to the normal protections of communal justice. In this system, court and sanctuary are not separate. Legal authority and religious participation reinforce each other, and the Druid's role sits at the hinge. Some later scholars argued that the great Druid tribunal, at a central Gallic site, was already losing its force in the final decades before Roman conquest, perhaps becoming a fading survival rather than a living institution. That is possible, but the cause matters. One explanation often proposed is the weakening of older sacred kingship structures. If the Druids' authority was intertwined with the older model of divine or semi-divine rule, then political disruption would naturally erode the institutions that depended on it. Other scholars try to define the fines and compensations that such judges imposed, imagining a structured system where one payment punished the offender while another compensated the injured family. Others suggested that the most serious cases followed a hard logic of retaliation. Reports of execution by fire appear in ancient commentary, sometimes framed as sacrifice that pleased the gods and even aided fertility. That last claim is revealing because it links law, death, ritual, and agriculture into a single worldview. The judge is also a ritual specialist, and punishment becomes part of cosmic maintenance. Greek and Roman authors also credit Druids with an unusual public function: stopping violence. Accounts describe them stepping between armed forces as battles were about to begin, calming combatants with words and presence, as if men on the verge of killing could be held in check by recognized authority. Similar statements claim that they once arbitrated even in wartime disputes. Irish tradition does not emphasize this pacifying role in the same way, and at times presents Druids as combatants, or as supernatural opponents engaged in direct conflict. A Druid can appear as a herald delivering demands for tribute, or as an active participant in mythic war. The contrast may reflect differences in sources and genres rather than a clean historical difference. But it is worth noting. the Druid is not always portrayed as a peacemaker. In some traditions, he is also a weapon. Healing is another recurring thread. Druid medicine is often presented as herbal and ritual at once. Plants are gathered with strict rules about timing, posture, and which hand must be used. A remedy is not only a substance, but an action performed correctly. Mistletoe appears as a famous antidote and treatment. Other plants are said to protect against accidents, cure eye trouble, drive away fever, or prevent harm to cattle. Later, rural customs in parts of France show a similar pattern, where a plant used for livestock is gathered on a saint's day, with ceremony and then blessed by a priest. Such examples make it difficult to separate medicine from charm in traditional practice because the same action can be described either way, depending on the storyteller's worldview. Irish sagas also assign Druids a medical role. A hero's household expects that a Druid can find the hidden cause of sickness. In another episode, poisoned wounds are treated not by surgery, but by ritual bathing in milk from white cattle, after which the wounded recover. Whether these scenes reflect real practice or mythic symbolism, they show that the Druids' authority extended into crisis moments where life and death were at stake. Some later writers also claim that Druids served as genealogists and keepers of records, preserving descent lines and the memory of expeditions. The statement is difficult to prove directly, but it fits the logic of a learned caste in an oral society. Whoever trains the elite and speaks in formal settings tends to become the keeper of pedigrees, claims, and histories. Even when the record is legendary, the social role is coherent. Then there is the question of women. References to female religious specialists appear so often that they cannot simply be dismissed, but their status is unclear. Ireland offers even richer terminology. Stories speak of prophetesses and female seers, and the word Druid woman also appears. Legend claims that a Christian convent famous for maintaining a sacred flame was built over an older site where women had kept a fire in pagan times, a story that may preserve memory of continuity or may simply reflect the desire to give sacred places a deeper past. Irish myth goes further and names powerful female figures described as learned in magic, who bring darkness, storm, or terror on enemies. Other named women are remembered as enchantresses, foster mothers of heroes, or transformers who use water or other forces to change a person's life. Some of these are clearly mythical, but they reveal the cultural expectation that female specialists existed at least in the imaginative landscape. Late Roman biographies add dramatic tales of Druid women prophesying to emperors. One warns a ruler not to expect victory. Another tells a future emperor that he will rise after killing the boar, a riddle later explained through a political assassination of a man nicknamed Boar. A third has women foretelling the fate of dynasties. Modern scholars have questioned these stories, pointing out that the Latin word used for these women can mean a nymph rather than a priestess, that the geography sits near frontier zones where Roman imagination about barbarian prophecy was especially active, and that earlier 1st century authors are largely silent about such figures. The most plausible reading is that these women, if they existed at all, were diviners rather than full ritual officiants, and that the Druid label reflects Roman habit of calling any Celtic prophetess by the most famous sacred title they knew. Reports of women living in island sanctuaries off the Atlantic coast of Gaul complicate the picture again. One account describes 9 virgins believed to control weather, advise sailors, and shift into animal forms. Another tells of an island where men were forbidden, where women served a god compared to Bacchus, and where a yearly ritual rebuilding of the temple roof ended in violent punishment if a worker dropped her burden. Some scholars think these tales echo Greek epic motifs, especially stories of enchanted islands and powerful women. Others argue that, while literary influence is possible, the details do not align neatly enough to dismiss them as pure borrowing. They may preserve a distorted memory of local cults that outsiders found strange and therefore described with the language of marvels. Among the best-known figures in Irish Druid tradition stands Mag Ruath, a character surrounded by stories that blend travel, politics, and spectacular displays of magic. In later legend, he is described as a master of forbidden knowledge, a man whose reputation reached beyond Ireland. The tales claim that, after absorbing what the tradition called the wells of learning in Ireland and Scotland, he set out with his daughter, Tlachtga, toward the Mediterranean world. The journey leads to Italy and to a famous antagonist from early Christian storytelling, Simon Magus. In these accounts, Mag Ruath and Tlachtga become partners in Simon's dramatic contest with the Christian apostles, not as passive observers, but as skilled collaborators. The central image in the Mag Ruath cycle is a strange flying device, remembered under names that describe it as a wheel, able to move through the sky. It functions as a symbol of daring and deception at once. A machine-like marvel meant to prove that Simon's power surpasses that of his rivals. The story reaches its climax in Rome, under the gaze of imperial authority. The wheel is said to rise, display its force, and then collapse in a public disaster. Simon is badly injured when the attempt ends in failure. Tlachtga is then cast as the one who gathers the broken remnants and brings them back across the sea to Ireland, turning the wreckage into a new set of dangers on Irish soil. The fragments are described as two massive stones, carried home and set in different places. The legends surrounding them are deliberately extreme, as if the physical remains of an enchanted object cannot be neutral. Looking at the stones brings blindness, touching them brings death. This kind of detail signals how the tradition thinks about magic. It is not merely an act performed and then finished, but a force that leaves residue behind. Even shattered, it continues to harm. Some interpreters treat the wheel as a disguised solar symbol, a turning power linked to the sky and the passage of light. The myth has even been compared to classical stories about reckless flight, because it turns ambition into catastrophe, and because it frames the air itself as a stage for punishment. Mag Ruath is not only a builder of marvels in these stories, he is also an active rival in the political and spiritual battles of Ireland. One tale has him driving a king and the king's Druids out of Munster through spells and fires, as if authority can be pushed back by a stronger ritual force. Another story describes an aerial duel with a competing Druid, a combat imagined above the earth rather than on it, where victory depends on mastery of the unseen. The same figure is credited with a more practical act as well, restoring water to a people in crisis. When sources are said to have been sealed by hostile magic, Mag Ruath finds a spring by shooting an arrow into the sky and marking where it falls. The method is symbolic and simple, yet the result is life-saving. In return, he receives land, and later tradition goes even further, claiming that families in the region carried his bloodline into historical times. Whether that last claim is believable or not, it shows what such legends are often doing. They bind mythic power to real landscapes and real names, making the past feel close enough to touch. Later writers who tried to assemble lists of famous Druids often included figures like Mag Ruath, among many others. Healers who discovered remedies against poisoned arrows, court Druids attached to named kings, men remembered for instigating wars, and rulers who supposedly carried Druid learning even after they left the throne. Some entries read like compressed saga summaries, Others sound like place name explanations, where a frightening local spirit becomes the Druid of a nearby mountain. The point of these catalogues is not accuracy in the modern sense. They reveal how widespread the memory of Druids became in Irish tradition, how easily the title could be attached to healers, prophets, advisors, and dangerous wonder workers. One name stands out by its absence from the older record, Merlin. Later, medieval literature makes him the classic Druid-like enchanter, but earlier documents do not clearly support that identity. His Druid label is largely a product of later storytelling, not something firmly anchored in the earliest evidence. This detail matters because it shows how the image of the Druid could expand over time, pulling new legendary figures into its orbit as generations reimagined the past. Behind the stories of individuals lies a larger question. What kind of religion did the Druids actually serve? If the Druids acted as the ministers of sacrifice in Gaul, then they cannot be separated from the gods their communities honoured. Caesar, when describing Gaulish belief, uses Roman god names such as Mercury, Apollo, Mars, Jupiter, and Minerva, but the description is best understood as translation rather than literal identity. The gods behind those labels were local Celtic deities, interpreted through a Roman lens. In the same stretch of his account, the Druids appear as the specialists connected to ritual practice, which leaves a strong implication that they were deeply entangled with the wider pantheon. Caesar also reports a tradition that the Gauls claimed descent from a god associated with the underworld. He says this belief was handed down by the Druids, which presents them not merely as ritual performers, but as keepers of origin stories. The detail about counting time by nights rather than days fits the same pattern. It frames the cosmos in a way that gives darkness a kind of priority. Similar ideas appear in Irish mythic structures, where forces linked with darkness are sometimes placed earlier in the imagined order of the world than the gods of daylight and life. Later, scholars have tried to connect the underworld figure described by Caesar with Irish divine names associated with death, though such identifications remain interpretive rather than certain. The long education described for Druid students points in the same direction. If the training truly lasted as long as ancient authors claim, then the memorized material was not a short handbook of spells. It must have contained a large body of sacred narrative, ritual formulae, and moral teaching, something closer to an oral library than a set of tricks. Comparisons have been made to other cultures that preserved vast sacred corpora by recitation alone, guarding them from casual use by keeping them out of writing. If Irish myth, even filtered through Christian scribes, preserves only a portion of what once circulated, then the scale of Druid learning becomes easier to imagine. Classical authors also suggest that Druid teaching included a strong belief in the endurance of the soul. Greek and Roman writers repeatedly attribute to Druids the claim that the spirit does not simply vanish at death, and that death is not a final border, but a transition. Poets turn this into dramatic language, presenting the idea as a challenge to fear itself. The dead do not remain in a silent underworld forever, but enter divine power associated with magical skill and control of natural forces, especially weather. Welsh tradition offers parallel figures who seem to inherit the same role, passing along a toolkit of illusion and transformation from one divine personality to another. Yet these identifications come from sources written long after Druidism had faded in Gaul, so caution is necessary. They may preserve older memories, but they may also reflect a later habit of reducing Druidism to magic, and then assigning it a single patron. Even so, an older and broader theme appears again and again: the sacred oak. Across Europe, the oak carried religious weight long before any neat theological system could be written down. One approach argues that early Druid belief began with reverence for the oak, not only as a symbol, but as a giver of life. Long before agriculture dominated diets, forests mattered. Oak wood built shelters and boats, fueled fires, and fed animals. Most importantly, the oak produced acorns, and archaeological finds show that acorns were stored and eaten even in communities that also cultivated grain. Classical writers confirm that acorn bread was real food in multiple regions, and that in times of scarcity people returned to it. Poetry preserves the memory in a different form, calling the oak man-feeding, as if the tree itself once acted as a mother of humankind. From there, the step into worship is not hard to understand. In many early societies, trees were treated as living beings filled with spirit. Some communities imagined certain trees as dwellings of the dead or as seats of divine presence. Whole groves could become untouchable because the supernatural was believed to inhabit them. In that framework, a powerful oak could become more than a resource. It could become the visible body or house of a god. Over time, the spirit of a tree could be imagined less as a hidden force and more as a personal deity with human shape, while still keeping the same powers, the ability to bring rain, protect herds, and strengthen crops. This is not a uniquely Celtic process. It is a pattern seen in many parts of the world, where animistic ideas gradually harden into structured polytheism. European religion offers vivid examples of oak cults outside the Celtic sphere. In Greece, Zeus was honoured at Dodona in a sanctuary where an oak stood at the centre of worship, and divine will was sought through the sounds and signs connected to the tree. Other Greek festivals describe rituals, where an oak is selected, cut, and shaped into an image, then dressed and treated as a bride in a story of divine reconciliation. Beneath the later myth, the ritual suggests a seasonal drama of sacred marriage tied to nature and renewal. These parallels do not prove that Druids copied Greek practice, but they do show how natural it was for Indo-European religions to locate divine power in the oak and to build ritual around it. In Gaul, a horned god is sometimes shown holding a bag spilling acorns or mast, feeding animals that gather at his side. This image ties divinity directly to forest fertility and to the oak's fruit. Some researchers have wondered whether such a figure absorbed older oak symbolism and became, in certain regions, a later face of the same deep idea, a god of the wild, of abundance and of the powers that live in the forest. Other named deities have been connected to Druid worship as well. A thunder god associated with fire sacrifice, a war god with royal overtones, and a bright fire festival god whose name echoes in seasonal rites. These links are debated, but the overall shape remains plausible. Druids, as ritual specialists, would have served the principal gods of their communities, rather than operating apart from them. Ancient authors add one more crucial detail about ritual practice. In Gaul, sacrifice was not treated as something anyone could do on a whim. At least one learned mediator was expected to be present, a figure described as a philosopher of the divine, someone believed to understand the gods well enough to make offerings intelligible. Some interpret this as a division of labour between a sacrificer and a theological specialist. Caesar's wording, however, presents Druids themselves